Hi, I'm Claudia Boleyn, and I'm going to talk about some of the deeper social themes I personally saw in The Timeless Children, as well as in Series 12's overall arc. I'm also going to talk about why I think The Timeless Children is one big old British Empire analogy. Are you suffering comfortably? Then we'll begin. Let's start with addressing the British Empire analogy head on. To me, it was pretty hard to miss, but a lot of people still did, and no offence if that was you, but when you have family history tied to colonialism and Britain being really very awful to certain people, it hits you like a truck. The Time Lords are revealed to have built an empire on lies. Instead of telling a truthful history, they resort to myth-making in an attempt to portray themselves as naturally superior and born to rule, as the Master so wonderfully states. While they gain their own power from experimenting on a little girl of unknown origin, and base their society on what they've learned from and taken from her, her contribution is ultimately erased, and strikingly, the Time Lords decide on a non-interference policy, which prevents Time Lords from interfering in other times and places, which is a rule built on hypocrisy, as Tecteun adopting the apparently orphan child is what allowed Time Lord culture to flourish and grow in the first place. The British Empire gained money and power by using and abusing other countries, for example India, which was looted and warped by the British to the extent that when India finally gained independence and the British had to leave, India's share of the world economy, which had been 23% before British rule, had dropped to 3%. This drop, as well as the violence and bloodshed caused by partition the British created, which can be seen in Vinay Patel's episode Demons of the Punjab, allowed Britain to present themselves as saviours of what they could argue had been a barbaric and financially unstable country all along. India are now expected to be grateful for British interference, despite the country having been denied its own natural history and development. Just as within The Timeless Children, the narrative is set as benevolent rescuer and helpless rescuee, who is expected to withstand any number of abuses because of their lower status, in exchange for being partly taken in, but not wholly accepted, by the dominant group. Off the top of my head, two of the largest parallels are with India and the Windrush generation. So after Britain hijacked India's history and used their resources for their own gain, apologists used the idea of the generous British who built India's thriving railways. But what they fail to mention is that the British made extortionate amounts of money from these railways, paid for by Indian taxes. And then, when Indian mechanics made their own trains, the British passed a law to prevent them from creating this competition, and therefore building their own wealth. Under British rule, Indians fought in both the First and Second World War for the British, and yet were left to starve by British hero Winston Churchill, not to mention their mysterious erasure from the Great Britain myth, exemplified by the unpleasant Lawrence Fox's recent bizarre comments about seeing a Sikh soldier in a World War I film causing such disbelief that it stopped him from focusing on the film. We also have the Windrush generation. For those who are unaware, during World War II, many Caribbean countries were still under British rule, and therefore they served in the British Armed Forces. Following the war, Britain advertised for workers from the colonies, which appealed to many people living in poverty and who had lost everything during their service for Britain in World War II. The reason they are called the Windrush generation is that the first ship they boarded for Britain was called the Empire Windrush. Therefore, the diversity we see in Britain today is a direct result of Britain's colonialisation of different countries during empire. Despite fighting for Britain and being invited to work, having learned English as a second language and being promised better lives, they faced racism and discrimination in Britain. Their families settled here in a racist environment and for 70 years helped build the Britain we see today. Fast forward to now, where people who were kids when they came to Britain, whose families came over when Britain asked, are being told they came here illegally because the British authorities didn't keep a proper record of them. After the Windrush generation had been invited here, the hospital laws changed, and people were required to have official paperwork in order to receive healthcare, benefits, etc. So many of the Windrush generation were at a disadvantage. Some were sent to immigration detention centres, essentially treated as criminals despite being used for cheap labour and building their lives in Britain. You cannot separate the success and wealth of Britain from the abuses of colonisation and empire, nor can you separate it from the contributions of those who came here to create lives, sometimes against their will. I believe in Doctor Who Series 12, Chris Chibnall is making a statement about what it means to be British. Right now, we have people claiming there are too many immigrants in Britain. They talk about Britain like it was created by white people for white people. But this Britain, as demonstrated by so many people with St George's flags in their profile pictures on Twitter, is a myth. Just as the Time Lords could not have discovered the ability to regenerate without experimenting on the young Doctor, Britain could not have been built without the abuse of the other, which is then hidden and denied. So the pompous Time Lords could not be more British Empire if they tried, down to their exclusive elite society of mostly white people in previous Who. their superior attitudes and disdain for other races, and the way they put a wise, benevolent face on their power and control over the universe. Ever heard of the white man's burden? It means that white Western civilization actually thought it was some moral duty of theirs to force Western culture on the black people in the colonies, as if they needed to civilize them, when in fact these people had cultures of their own, some of which have been damaged almost beyond repair. Tecteun using the Doctor for her regenerative powers, experimenting on her despite what we presume was great discomfort, is similar to the way the British would experiment on their colonial subjects, both admiring their skills and regarding them as lesser, less human than they were, thus suitable guinea pigs. One example is their experimentation in East Africa, where they performed vivisections on men almost daily. I'm going to get into this in much greater depth, but I hope I've managed to give a quick explanation for why I think Chris Chibnall is creating an intentional parallel between the British Empire and the Time Lord society the Doctor ran away from. Now I'd like to discuss some other themes dealt with in The Timeless Children and explain my interpretations. So let's begin with the power of history, something I'm pretty sure we can all agree is one of the wider themes of Doctor Who, owing to the fact our protagonist can go back in time. But in my reading, Chris Chibnall takes the idea of history one step further in Series 12. This series served to highlight lesser-known historical figures or people that were integral to building the society we now enjoy, but were erased or overshadowed by gender, or in Nikola Tesla's case, xenophobia. Nikola Tesla's Night of Terror is based around the idea that Tesla and Thomas Edison are both brilliant men, but only one, as a white American, will get the glory. The other must suffer prejudice and discrimination. This series also chooses to focus on Ada Lovelace, whose work led to the computer, and introduce viewers to Noor Inayat Khan, a British spy of Indian and American heritage, who was the first British female wireless operative to be sent into occupied France to aid the resistance. Noor especially is a pretty groundbreaking addition, as with Vinay Patel's fantastic Demons of the Punjab last series, it seems Chibnall's idea is to shine a light on the contributions of those you might not learn about in school, or even bring to mind. From the images of an Indian World War I soldier on Remembrance Weekend to having Noor be the hero of the resistance, Chibnall is changing the way this generation of kids view the past. The importance of histories for peoples and cultures is exemplified by even the Master, who is destructive beyond the point of reason, deciding to keep the collection of Time Lord histories. He says, "A databank of every Time Lord consciousness living and dead, every experience, every memory, the lived history of our race. I destroyed a lot of things, but not this trove of secrets." So staying on this theme of history, Series 12 seems very keen to ask us who writes history. It's an important question and one that should bother just about anyone in Britain right now. We're still fighting to have the truth of the British Empire taught factually in schools, because at the moment it seems like we're still stuck in a bit of a patriotic myth of British greatness and goodness. I'm sure I don't need to tell you that the truth of Britain's history is far more messy and complicated, and that as well as the positive things we achieved, we also caused a lot of harm and suffering, a lot of which is still being felt today. Just for saying this, I'm pretty sure I'll get at least one message telling me this means I supposedly hate Britain and should go back to India. A country I've never been to. Anyway, all we need to do is look at our most glorified political figures to understand how skewed the most popular version of history is. Doctor Who itself has been guilty of this, and this is something I will be endlessly seething about, in its Series 5 episode Victory of the Daleks, which seemed to be positioned as a charming tale about all things good and British, written of course by Mark Gatiss himself, who seems to enjoy these British myths maybe a little bit too much, but I digress. In that episode, Winston Churchill was portrayed as a lovable rogue, a hero figure, a grumpy old man. Now, I'm not suggesting Mark Gatiss is a racist here, far from it, but what we are seeing is the British history myths being told and retold, passed down without question, and so the ideas solidify. Churchill has become an emblem of British success and glory, when to those with Indian heritage, the man is a figure of cruelty and darkness. This is a Doctor Who video, so I won't talk too much about how awful Winston Churchill was, although I could talk about that all day. But here are a few choice examples for anyone who thinks I am falsely besmirching the name of that dude Britain First supporters really like. When the British built concentration camps in South Africa, Churchill declared they produced the minimum of suffering. 48,000 people died, by the way. When the Kurds rebelled against British rule, he said, "I am strongly in favour of using poison gas against uncivilised tribes." Of Gandhi, yes, that Gandhi, he said, "He ought to be lain bound hand and foot at the gates of Delhi and then trampled on by an enormous elephant with the new viceroy seated on its back." He proudly stated, "I hate Indians. They are a beastly people with a beastly religion." Lovely. And when the famine in Bengal happened, because of British imperial policies, Churchill was begged to give them food and supplies. not just by the people, but by his officials. He refused because he thought the Indians were breeding like rabbits and he wanted to cull the population. 3 million people died. So it makes all the difference when a show like Doctor Who decides to examine our history myths rather than simply regurgitate them. This is where Chris Chibnall hiring a diverse writing team is really bearing fruit. In The Timeless Children, we discover that the history of the Time Lords passed down through generations was a lie. History is always written by those in power and by those with privilege, which again is why there's such a huge difference between Mark Gatiss' Churchill propaganda, sorry Mark, and Vinnie Patel's Demons of the Punjab, which showed the realities of British rule and the violence and anguish of partition. The Doctor and the Master have to face the fact they've grown up being fed lies of inherited greatness, much like the audience of British kids watching. In short, it matters who's writing the stories. Now for Stolen Histories. If we've learned this series that history can be a powerful tool for oppression and domination, what we also learn is that uncovering a true history of a person or a culture can be empowering and a positive step into the future and healing. In the case of the Doctor, we discover that after the series of experiments, in which she had countless lives, many of which it was implied were cut short due to the testing, she had her memory wiped and was presumably regressed to a child. In denying the Doctor her history, she is disadvantaged and powerless. This is even more relevant because the Doctor's actual species and origin is unknown, which instantly creates a rift between her and her culture. The Doctor's power and importance is kept from her, her individuality, what makes her unique, is kept from her. The Time Lords attempt to keep her both compliant and unable to threaten them by denying her knowledge of her past. As we have learned, those in power will often alter the histories they tell, something that can be exemplified in the real world by the example of the Benin bronzes. Now, the Benin bronzes are a set of really beautiful plaques and sculptures created to decorate the Kingdom of Benin, which is in Nigeria today. These were created from as early as the 13th century by the Edo people. However, when Europeans came to the Kingdom of Benin to colonise, they not only looted the bronzes, which was so important to Benin and Nigerian art and culture, but they believed the people of Benin were too primitive to have created them in the first place, and instead decided on the theory that the people of Benin must have had contact with Europeans at some point in order to have learned such impressive craftsmanship. To this day, the British Museum won't return these bronzes, despite their cultural significance, which is an act of denied history. In fact, when British officials first tried to take control of Benin, they were attacked by Oba warriors, and only 2 survived. As an act of punishment and revenge, a London expedition returned to sack and destroy Benin City. All those years of history and skill and art erased. In The Timeless Children, the Doctor is trapped via paralysis field in the Matrix by the Master, feeling weak and defeated. That is until she talks to an earlier version of herself, Jo Martin's Doctor. This literal representation of her past gives the Doctor strength, and she takes heart in their similarities. It is the first moment that the Doctor starts to view the idea of her previously hidden history as a strength, as multitudes within her that she has yet to utilise or explore. As she tells the Master, discovering a rich history doesn't make her lesser, no matter how tragic the stories she is told. It makes her more. The Doctor takes strength from her past to the extent that Chibnall gives us visual imagery of her breaking out of the Matrix by remembering all of her former lives and taking power from them, despite her trauma. The last face the Doctor sees before success is the face of Jo Martin's Doctor, who no longer represents trauma, pain and fear to the Doctor, but a new part of herself. She tells the Master she's been given a gift, because instead of her traumatic history breaking her, the truth being known and acknowledged empowers her. Taking back the narrative. Sacha Dhawan is, in my eyes, the best Master we've ever had, which makes me a little biased. And Sacha, if you're ever single, then call me. But it struck me as significant that as a British Indian actor, Sacha's Master was not only given the role of uncovering the corruption of the Time Lords, again a British Empire allegory, but Chibnall gave the Master a huge portion of the scenes and dialogue this episode. This again feeds into the idea that whoever controls the narrative holds the power. The 2 characters that are able to offer the Doctor answers this episode are Jo Martin's Doctor and Sacha Dhawan's Master, both people of colour, and in my opinion, both the best things about this whole series. The history of the Time Lords, a society so mythologised and popular in geek culture, meant to symbolise ultimate intelligence and one usually so extremely white, was told by characters of colour. Not only were the Time Lords exposed, and I loved the idea of an Indian Master unmasking the British Empire allegory, but the Doctor's position in this episode was to listen and to learn. Some people have complained that the Doctor's role in this episode was too passive, but I actually think it was a clever move by Chris Chibnall to allow Sacha Dhawan's master to take charge of the episode. The abuse of black women. It probably hasn't escaped your attention that instead of the usual fan portrayal of the young Doctor as a little white boy, Chris Chibnall decided to portray the Doctor as a black little girl. Even without the context of this casting in the episode, to choose to portray the Doctor this way, and in her very first incarnation, is groundbreaking and sends a firm message that the Doctor can regenerate into any colour and any gender. Just as Chibnall gave us our very first South Asian master, and to his credit, Stephen Moffat gave us Missy, who, despite taking on a questionable name change, definitely got uncomfortable viewers one step closer to accepting a female Doctor, there is now no way that the show or fandom can ever return to the idea that only white men can be the Doctor. And in doing this, Chibnall is challenging their superiority in fandom spaces, which, as a mixed-race woman, I can tell you is insufferable to say the least. This is a country where racism against black people, especially black women, is commonplace. We regularly see black women in media abused online. One example I can think of is Diane Abbott. And famously, Meghan Markle's treatment by the British media, in contrast to the other white royals, has pointed out the alarming double standards that exist in our society for black women. When Jo Martin's character Ruth announced herself as the Doctor, I was sceptical. Not because I didn't adore her, but because it seemed she would take a back seat to the current White Doctor, or that she might be revealed to be from a parallel universe and thus be written out of canon at a later date. Thankfully to the non-racist and Jo Martin fans out there, Chibnall didn't take the easy route of appeasing racists by making Ruth's Doctor's connection to the current Doctor vague and ignorable. In The Timeless Children, not only is the Doctor's original form that of a little black girl, who is shown to live ominously short lives as various races later on, but it is Jo Martin's Doctor who appears to our current Doctor when she is at her most broken. After discovering her disturbing history, it is Jo Martin's Doctor that the Doctor's mind subconsciously summons for support and guidance. This gives Martin's Doctor not only the power of serving as an equal, and I think it could be argued even a mentor figure to the current incarnation, but also seems to back up the theme of white people standing on the shoulders of people of colour, often black women. Something I won't get into in too much depth here is the idea of white feminism, which is particularly present in the Doctor Who fandom, owing to Jodie's casting. To put it simply, white feminists, as they are called, are not feminists who are white. You guys are great, by the way. But are white feminists who care only for the rights and uplifting of white women, usually at the expense of minority groups. A simple example of this might be a fan loving Michelle Gomez as Missy, but then deciding the caster of Sacha is a step too far. It is not always as obvious as this, and can take the more subtle form of white women in fandom spaces being dismissive to the marginalised and trying to dictate or create a group point of view, getting angry when people of colour, who sometimes have different experiences, speak up. You often see this with white feminists defending a piece of media with a white female lead against attacks by marginalised people. The very act of disagreement or critique from someone they do not deem as their equal, appearing to them as troublemaking. Of course, simply having a white female lead should not mean a piece of media is perfect, but these women seem to project onto the Doctor as a hero figure and symbol of their own power, which means criticisms of the media equals criticisms of not only them, but their supremacy and power over others in fandom spaces. And again, this is very complicated, because this often comes from the experience of even white women feeling this exact same sense of being insignificant or lesser by some white men in fandom. Even summarising it for you, it's a lot, and actually very interesting in terms of psychology and social justice. A lot of people have read the choice of the young Doctor being a black girl and the experiments on her by her loving but abusive white mother as a subtle comment about slavery. It is certainly relevant that the mistreatment of this black little girl is what allows the mostly white race of the Time Lords to advance. Just as families still hold great wealth today from inheriting the money made from owning slaves and plantations, while the inheritance of the families of slaves is often intergenerational trauma, and that's only if these families were able to exist in the first place. The young Doctor experiences pain under the guise of being cared for. She is used for profit and supremacy, yet she herself sees none of the benefits. A little black girl has been holding up the entire Time Lord society from the start, and they've done everything they possibly can to squash that truth. This is one of the reasons I think it is important Jo Martin's Doctor has her own series, and potentially appears as the 14th Doctor, perhaps with 13 subconsciously wanting to reclaim her history by using one of her past faces. If Jo Martin's Doctor only exists as a way for 13 to learn about herself and as a support for her in Timeless Children, then we could very well be seeing the pattern of women of colour, especially black women, being used to prop up white women all over again. On the subject of trauma, I wanted to talk about the theme of trauma that is buried or hidden. This also has a racial element due to the intergenerational trauma I mentioned, and the way that society seems to require a denial of the violence done to people of colour or else be branded a troublemaker. The Doctor's trauma is interesting in this episode because the hidden nature of her trauma is not because of her own attempts to forget, but because she has her own memories erased or even altered to make them seem more palatable. There is potential discussion to be had here about how this ties into abuse, with memories by the abused person being accused of being inaccurate by the perpetrator, who puts a very different spin on the same remembered events. Certainly we can see an element of this with Brendan's scenes, later revealed to be the Doctor's disguised memories. In these scenes, the scenery is picturesque. There is something comforting about the lie, from the loving family home to the bright tone the scenes are shot in, which is so at odds with the show's usually murky palette. What we are seeing here is not only the idea of a breach of consent, taken to such an extreme that even your own mind cannot be trusted, again, something those in abusive situations will experience is questioning their own memories, but an idealised version of events. It is notable to me that the Doctor herself is revealed to have been a part of Time Lord society. Despite being experimented on, abused, and probably indoctrinated, at one point she does seem to be going along with their ideas. This complicates her as a character and how we position her within the story, because it means that despite being a victim, she must also struggle with the guilt of her complicity, however brief it may have been. The romanticised version of events, what we see as Brendan's scenes, demonstrate the careful crafting of a new narrative, not only meant to support Time Lord supremacy, but also one meant to avoid guilt, which is the most dangerous emotion imaginable in such a regime. The perpetrators, and those who are complicit, as demonstrated in real-life regimes, are not always those who would think of themselves as bad people. The Time Lords would not like to think of themselves as bad people. Therefore, in their version of events, the one the Doctor remembers, events are altered just enough to make their actions seem compassionate. Is Brendan being evaluated in sinister scenes as if he is about to be sent to war? Yes, but that's what he wants, and he has the love and support of his parents. Does Brendan seem to be pursuing someone in what looks like a threatening confrontation? Yes, but the person was bad and he didn't want to do it. In the false images, the young Brendan is shown playing with his father, helping him with the farm, being adored by his parents. But we later find out the truth is that the Doctor is being experimented on over and over. Tecteun loves her, yes, but it is not the wholesome, comforting, responsible love seen in the Brendan scenes. The difference between these sequences is alarming in itself, because there is the implicit idea that at some level the Time Lords or Tecteun knew what they were doing was not correct or loving, hence the need to hide it. It feels very much like hiding the evidence for crime while simultaneously trying to deny the crime exists. Linking this to Empire again, this technique is similar to the ways the acts of the British Empire were justified. Just as Brendan's playmate was vilified in order to retain his heroic image, we see they were just a child, the people whose countries were taken over by the British were said to be uncivilised savages who needed Western intervention. Again, we have the concept of the white man's burden. In terms of India, if the cruelty and injustice of British rule is discussed, you will undoubtedly hear people claiming that what the British did was a necessary kindness, and this is not their fault either. They have been presented with a rose-tinted view of what happened, in which the bad things that happened were mostly the fault of the Indians themselves, who were unruly and ungrateful, and that all in all it was a wonderful time that advanced the country. These people seem to be experiencing their very own versions of Brendan's scenes as they collectively convince themselves of the moral righteousness of their ancestors in order to retain a full sense of self, one which rests on the actions of people who existed and acted before they were born. I've been long-winded here, but what I'm saying is that the rose-tinted idea of history in the episode is something we see when looking back at the British Empire and colonialism, and that the facade is insisted upon, even when the truth starts leaking through. At the end, when Brendan is clearly being made to experience pain as his mind is wiped, in one of the most eerie moments of the episode, the colours are still bright, the world is still made to look homely and idyllic. The positive narrative is being forced tonally, despite the reality of what we are seeing, which is a man screaming. This is excellent work, either by Chris or the people working on direction and colouring of the segments. The visual storytelling is clear. The Doctor is replaced by a white man, in what is probably the first time I have seen the idea of whitewashing history broached so obviously and cleverly on primetime TV for kids. Watchmen did this very well, but it is not for children. The white man in a position of power, a police officer, gives the story a respectable veneer and even tricks racists into rooting for Brendan before the big reveal about who this character actually is. It's also interesting to read this as a subtle criticism of the police force, which may not have been intentional by Chibnall, as he has written Yaz as a police officer without making much comment on it. Although Brendan is not seen to do any bad deeds as a police officer, there is a definite ominous sense of him giving his life to something unworthy, and that he is heading for catastrophe. The validation Brendan is seen to crave as a policeman is uncomfortable to watch, and is even more interesting in light of the reveal of what he's really part of and what the police in these scenes represent. And what do they represent? Well, they represent our next theme, which is military manipulation. This is an idea we've seen in Doctor Who many times before. The Doctor famously does not like guns. We're just going to forget Eleven's weird out-of-character writing here, okay? And despite having respect for soldiers, is not a fan of the military as it currently exists. And personally, I'm with the Doctor on this one. The Doctor has a strange relationship with the army because of this. The Doctor will sometimes work with UNIT, but disapproves of their way of doing things. The Doctor hates being saluted, as it seems to exemplify the power structures and hierarchies that exist within the military, and to a character like the Doctor would seem to stifle free thought and individualism, as well as placing some individuals as higher status than others. When it came to the Brigadier, for example, or Martha Jones, the Doctor's stance was very much, I respect you as people, so let's agree to disagree on this one. But it's certainly been a long time since we've seen quite such a scathing criticism of the military as we saw in The Timeless Children. Without villainising individual members of the armed forces, Chibnall attacks the very idea of imperialism and colonialism, and highlights that most armies, unfortunately, are encouraged to believe they are fighting for glory and righteousness for a country they love, in order to disguise the fact they are actually doing great wrong. This can be seen in the portrayal of Gat, back in Fugitive of the Jadoon, who can definitely be read by us as a villain, since she is after the Doctor and kills Lee, even crowing over it. Gat even talks like we'd expect a villain to, but it isn't that simple. Vinnie Patel shows us her reasoning and demonstrates her real dedication to her cause, one that she clearly thinks is right. She tells us, I serve at the glory of Gallifrey, and it is this dedication to her planet which causes her to help perpetuate evil. This is how colonialism happens, because those in charge skew the narrative. We see Gat looking genuinely distressed to see the Doctor's memories of Gallifrey burning. She has a real love for her planet and sees her work as defending the planet she loves. Even when pointing a gun at the Doctor, Jo Martin's Doctor seems to pity her. There is a sadness in her voice as she asks her not to shoot, something so absolutely the Doctor, as though she is mourning for her as a person, as though she pities her, because her fanaticism has given her meaning and she truly believes she's right. You can almost feel the Doctor wishing she had taken a different path and used that powerful love and dedication for better things. It's interesting that in Fugitive of the Jadoon, Lee keeps his service medal. He says he wants to fix it and polish it, because honour and courage still mean something. Gat agrees with him, which points out the very problem with armies and the military being based on noble yet vague ideas of courage and nobility. Gat is accompanied by the Jadoon here, the space police, who are often seen as an inconvenience and a threat within the show, liable to make mistakes and shoot before thinking. It is interesting that in this scene, the police and a representative of the army are set up as antagonists to two hero figures who have actively abandoned their posts. The two characters that appear to have looked deeper and used independent thought have realised that the values of honour and glory are not reflected in whatever military action the Time Lords had the division do. In The Timeless Children, we have this theme of a corrupt military, which uses good people for its own gain, repeated. The Time Lord we assume regenerates into the Gat we meet in Fugitive, due to their similar eye makeup, could not be more of a dodgy character. She states, the policy of the Time Lords is clear, strict non-intervention in other worlds and times. However, policy and reality sometimes diverge, which is essentially showing us that those who have power and who make it into roles of authority are often free to break the rules the rest of us have to follow, and because of their power are not held accountable. Chibnall is careful to position the person or organisation in charge as the villain and the ordinary troops or people in their employ as used and taken advantage of, as shown by Brendan having his mind wiped while he's awarded with a token of appreciation and thanked for his service. Now I'm going to discuss the theme of dual heritage, something particularly close to my heart as someone who is mixed race, half Indian and half English, and 100% British. Despite being adopted into the dominant society as a little girl of unknown origin, the Doctor is perceived as the other. This means that the Doctor's status as a Time Lord or Gallifreyan can seem conditional. If we use Time Lord society as a representative of Britain, then we already have plenty of interesting social readings to explore. On the theme of conditional or temporary Britishness that can be taken away, here in Britain we currently have an ongoing issue with people who are British citizens being made stateless due to their criminal behaviour. One such example is the Shamima Begum case, which I won't talk about too much here, but the simple version is that despite being born in Britain and being a British citizen legally, due to her actions of going to join a terrorist group, she was made stateless and denied not only re-entry to Britain, but her very identity as a British person. This was only possible because of the legal argument that Shamima's parents were of Bangladeshi origin. To be clear, Shamima could not have been made stateless legally had her parents been of white English origin. Therefore, taking any emotional response out of the case, what we can see is a discrepancy in the way British citizens can be treated based on their racial heritage. The public reaction to this case has been split, but a great many people support the government's decision, claiming that British citizenship is something that can be taken away. It would be wrong of me not to also note that some people seem to have come to this conclusion based on the fact Shamima Begum is a brown Muslim girl, and therefore some people inherently see her as other due to this. Following this case, a lot of people have spoken up, pointing out the way this process discriminates against British citizens who have parents from elsewhere, and this would actually put Dan and I at a disadvantage. For example, my best friend and I could both commit the same crime, but because her parents were born here and my father was born in India, they could legally send me out of Britain and make me go to India, while my friend would simply stand trial here. One of the people speaking up was Mallory Blackman, who wrote Rosa from Series 11. Needless to say, it's a distressing time to be of mixed heritage or just non-white here in Britain. Why is this relevant to Doctor Who? Well, let's look at the Doctor's history as a character and what Chris's addition to the canon does. The Doctor has long been regarded as one of Gallifrey's troublesome children, which both infantilises her and strips her of power, which, knowing what we do about what she's given them, or what she has had forcibly taken from her rather, seems deeply unfair, and shows us she is viewed as a threat. Although the Doctor has contributed to Time Lord legacy not only through her service for them or the experiments, but through simply being a part of their growing society, she is almost immediately cast out for daring to question the status quo. Despite building their society, the moment the Doctor begins to show independent thought and exercises agency, she is cast as the dangerous other, a troublemaker, someone they need to stop. I'm sorry, but you can't help but look at this from a racial lens when you are a person of colour or of mixed heritage. It is so common for those of us who show individuality or dare to criticise what we perceive as injustice to be instantly othered and reminded of our lesser state. It is, in my opinion, a richer social reading to view the Doctor's history of the Time Lords through this lens. There is an obsessive need to control her, to bring her to heel, as though as an other there is an almost special kick they get from making her submit to their authority. She is either used by the Time Lords or cast as their enemy. There is no point at which the Doctor is respected as an equal or as a true member of society. The Doctor themselves may not have known their history, and past series of the show probably never intended to give us this angle. But looking back now, Chibnall has given us a compelling new potential motive for the Time Lord's treatment of the Doctor. Has Rassilon known all along, for example? Has the Doctor's reputation and treatment always been because of an undercurrent of fear of the other? Is there also a concern about the abuse fighting back? Does the Doctor present as a danger because she has been historically mistreated, and therefore must be silenced for fear of bringing society down? Just as people panic and get angry and defensive when people point out that Winston Churchill was a racist, does the reality of the Doctor's existence threaten the supremacy myth? And do they resent her for her power? This interpretation alone is one of the reasons I think this addition to the canon has been a godsend, because it allows us to keep classic Who, but to add new, more relevant themes to the old material, so that the show can be politically meaningful today. In terms of dual heritage and the idea of the other, it's interesting that a conversation has been started about whether or not the Doctor counts as a Time Lord since she was adopted by the Shobogan Tecteun and is of unknown origin. I would argue that yes, she's definitely a Time Lord, although that's not all she is. The Time Lords were created through her. The whole idea in the episode is that the Time Lords are not these timeless beings that have always existed, but were built, just like any other society. If a society is built, created by a Shobogan explorer and scientist, who used the genetics of her adopted child of unknown origin, then the inherent elite status of being a Time Lord is being critiqued by the narrative. We hear how Tecteun had the idea of creating an elite group, which became the Time Lords, and the idea is to maintain power. This is an example of the ultimate pulling the ladder up behind you, with a woman who had nothing gaining in power and then preventing others from harnessing it. If we look at modern politics, a good example is someone like Priti Patel. I'm sorry, Tecteun, I know you experimented on your child, but even you don't deserve that comparison. Who, despite coming from immigrant parents herself, has recently put through new immigration controls, which would actually exclude her own parents from coming to Britain in the first place. Those rules would also exclude my family. It's hypocritical as hell. So if we use the title of Time Lord here and compare it to the idea of being British, we have similar themes coming through. Arguments about whether the Doctor truly counts as a Time Lord are being had, despite being one of the first and literally providing them with their greatest power. Her otherness, her duality, still makes her an outsider to some people. My father came to Britain from India as a child and now considers himself British. Like the Doctor, there are some people who will still see his otherness before anything else, and who cannot accept him as British. Yet when you ask them what makes someone British, to go back in history and explain it, their argument falls apart. Because just like Gallifreyan society, if we go back far enough, our societies were made by wanderers and travellers. They cannot be traced to any one particular point. Therefore, the idea of British purity, usually white British to the people who think this way, is a lie. Going forward, it will be interesting to see the Doctor try and make peace with her dual heritage. I personally still struggle to align the two parts of myself, the two cultures I come from, and I can imagine some very interesting future material for the Doctor, which focuses on her redefining herself on her terms, as a Gallifreyan by adoption, but also on reconnecting with her origins and exploring her unique history. Will the Doctor ever feel connected to the people she came from and their culture should she ever discover them? Or will she feel entirely Gallifreyan? Will finding out where she came from be a priority for her, or is that not something she needs? These are all interesting questions to ask, and ideas Chibnall can use in characterising and exploring 13, who at times has been lacking in a character arc. The idea of adopting a child of another race is also touched on in The Timeless Children, as is the theme of appropriation. Joy Piedmont, one of the creators of the Reality Bomb podcast, and who generally always has interesting things to say about the show, I will link her stuff in the description box below, brought up the idea of adoption being explored through the Doctor and Tech-Tayun. Despite love for the lone child, Tech-Tayun does not seem interested in connecting the Doctor with her own culture for the benefit of the child, but instead wants to know out of her own curiosity. The experiments on the Doctor show clearly that the love Tech-Tayun feels is flawed, as the Doctor becomes a project, an alien being, a pastime for Tech-Tayun, an obsession. Instead of loving the Doctor for her differences and being content with that, Tech-Tayun seeks to control and understand these talents, even to extract them. This could be read as an appropriation message, and actually reminds me of the themes of Get Out by Jordan Peele. An almost obsessive jealousy of the talents of people of colour, that despite outwardly seeming like appreciation, is actually about gain and appropriation. Tech-Tayun wants to take the Doctor's power, something that might be useful to her, with no thought for the well-being of the child herself. Time Lord society wants to become more like the Doctor, but they're also determined to control her abilities and use them for themselves. The pain of this child, this other, is seen as worth it, so that Tech-Tayun can have a learning experience, which sounds scarily similar to the treatment of minority groups today. Last but not least is the theme of self-hatred. This theme is relevant not only to the Doctor, but to a larger extent the Master, who in his current incarnation appears to be almost suicidal, fluctuating between seeming vainglorious and wildly ambitious, to having a complete disregard for his own life, and wanting to drag others down with him into the void. Is it weird to relate to the Master? This is interesting in terms of the Master's history, and Russell T Davies decided to position him as something of an abuse victim. Like the Doctor, he was used as a child for the greater purposes of the Time Lords, cursed with 4 beats in his head, a message for the future which slowly began to drive him mad. I've always been struck by the scene in The End of Time Part 2, where the Master screams, "You did this to me," at Rassilon. It sounds a lot like a child of abuse finally fighting back. You may be pleased to know that in canon, the Master supposedly shoved a white point star down Rassilon's throat after they all disappeared and made him regenerate. Good for him. Anyway, the Master, in my interpretation, has always been a survivor of abuse or at least of mistreatment. And so is the Doctor. Even before Russell T Davies and Chibnall's editions, it was clear that these were two Gallifreyans who were more free-thinking, and that their individuality meant they were seen as threats. The Master seems to be bullied by the Time Lords at points in Classic Who, doing their bidding against his will or to prove himself worthy, and the Doctor clearly has no interest whatsoever in their authority. He's already at a point where he thinks they're corrupt and has no concerns with cheating them and living his own life. So I perceive the Master and the Doctor as two examples of people who have survived abuse. What sets them apart is their reaction to this injustice. The Master seeks to belittle others the way he was belittled. His abuse has made him an abuser and given him an obsession with being in control because of his lack of control in the past. The Doctor's reaction to the injustice she suffered is to fight injustice wherever she sees it. Instead of being cruel because the world was cruel to her, she wants to make things better so others don't suffer. I think the fact the Doctor still has such love for the Master after all this time backs up my theory, because she can see why he is the way he is and has compassion for that. We know the Doctor would not usually be friends with a villain, someone who has done as much terrible things as the Master has, which leaves us with the explanation that in their past together, she saw what created him, and has also seen the potential in him to be good, which has somehow been scuppered. The Master overreacts in a big way to finding out the truth of the Time Lords. He decides to destroy the planet, burning Gallifrey and destroying the Citadel. It's all very symbolic, but this ties to his history of abuse and his belief that being kind is a weakness. The Master cannot stand being referred to as a victim. When the 10th Doctor says, "I forgive you," the Master can hardly take it. It's like he's being tortured. So when he finds out he only has his powers of regeneration, something he was proud of, because of the abuse of the Doctor, who is also a part of him now in some way, he can't cope. We can only speculate as to his full motives, but I think the Master feels a mixture of rage on the Doctor's behalf, as he seems so keen for her to discover why he did what he did, almost proud of it, like a cat bringing its owner a dead bird. Rage at the lies and hypocrisy of the Time Lords, and most of all, rage at his being coming from abuse and exploitation. This information plants victimization within him, right at his core. For a character so obsessed with ultimate power, this clearly knocks him off balance, and so he does what the Master always does, and gets revenge by throwing the abuse right back at the Time Lords. He also manages to harm the original victim, the Doctor, as a way to try and feel superior again. After all, seeing the Doctor broken makes him feel less broken. It's someone to be above. The Master cannot handle being insignificant, which again is what he feels after the revelation, because the Doctor, who is his fellow rebel against the system, has not only been revealed as an unwilling part of that system, but as someone special. They were supposed to be rebels together, causing trouble for the Time Lords, but now the Master feels like he was just a nuisance to them all along, and the Doctor was the major player, the one they really had an interest in. There's probably more to it than that, because the Master's psyche is an interesting and terrifying place. My favourite characters are often the ones that won't admit to any one motive because there's so much scope to explore. But the idea of being a part of both the oppressive and oppressed groups is relevant to his predicament. He's always found solace in his power of regeneration, something he felt was his, something he could be proud of, but now he's discovered it's just another bit of Time Lord meddling. This is a leap, but I think about this from the perspective of someone who is Indian and English like me. Think about someone who's British, but with Indian family. There's definitely a strange dissonance in understanding that one part of you, one side of your heritage, which you were once taught to be very proud of, and I'm talking about the Winston Churchill, the Queen propaganda, etc., actively harmed the other side of your heritage, so basically looted India and caused pain, death and suffering. India will now always be influenced by Britain and colonialism. No matter how India moves forward now, that is a bloody chapter of their history, and who knows where India could have gone if that had never happened. There is anger in that. And this still recent injustice is something people of Indian heritage will always have to deal with. Clearly, the Master burning Gallifrey is not the correct response. Even just as an analogy, we can see that it causes harm not only to a whole civilization in which there were undoubtedly good people, even if being fed lies, but to the Master himself, who despite trying to break the Doctor, seems to be the broken one. I'm not implying there should be no pushback, by the way, because if you know me, you'll know that I think anger is a hugely important quality to utilise when it comes to injustice. But as satisfying as it is, when you see Time Lord society as a metaphor for the British Empire, there are also a lot of dead people who get shoved in Cyberman suits, so let's not get carried away. Like I said, he also turns his pain on another victim, someone he should be showing compassion. Self-hatred is relevant to the Doctor because we already know that this is a character that, for all their eccentricities, carries a lot of guilt. The Doctor has been haunted by the Time War, and when written well, takes on more responsibilities than they need to, like setting themselves the task of being protector of the human race and saving every single person they meet. The Doctor's low self-esteem and self-hatred have always seemed to come out in acts of self-sacrifice, perhaps in a similar way to the Master's disregard for his own life. Only the Doctor feels they can't give up, unless it is in the service of good in some way. In The Timeless Children, the Doctor discovers she was a victim of abuse and manipulation when she was at her most vulnerable. Her memory was violated, and her body forced to regenerate without her consent. So what can we learn from the Doctor moving forward, based on how she tends to deal with pain? As the opposite to the Master, as I've said, the Doctor deals with pain by trying to help others. She never deals with her problems, but distracts herself with travelling and making up for all she feels guilty for. But this is one aspect of her life the Doctor can't run away from. Chris Chibnall has again introduced an interesting new dilemma and journey for our protagonist. The Doctor is said to have looked into the time vortex as a child and run away. The Master, in contrast, apparently went mad, which I think is probably Time Lord speak for started to rebel in a way they did not like. By placing this problem within the Doctor's mind and history, Chibnall gives her a problem she cannot escape or evade. The future stories will be led by what is within her, by her trying to come to terms with what she has learned and what that means for her. It's time for me to bring the British Empire into this again, but consider what this means in terms of how kids see Britain moving forward. We've already had Chibnall planting messages to question authority, to question history, and to think critically. What I hope we will go on to see is how the Doctor can come to terms with the darkness of Time Lord history, and how to move forward positively. In Britain we could do with that. Yes, we need to move forward, but we can only do that after we've acknowledged the faults in our past. The Doctor cannot find her peace until she talks to Jo Martin's Doctor. She needs to connect with the past, with the horrors, in order to create a new narrative and establish the truth. It's not nice to think that so many of the reasons Britain is considered great rest on the oppression of others, but it's important if we're to understand the social issues we are facing today, because our history and scandals like Windrush, for example, are directly linked to it. When we look at immigration in this country, the idea some people have of us being swamped by people of different races could be changed by teaching people the truth of our history. Yes, it's uncomfortable and painful. Yes, it's embarrassing to realise quite how many lies we've been told. And no, we shouldn't directly apologise for something we didn't personally do. But we need to, at the very least, acknowledge what our society was built on, so that we can move forward with new, better values like kindness and inclusion. I hope when the Doctor returns in 2021, we see her working out how to navigate her sense of self and forming a new identity, one which rejects the glorious myths and bravely faces the terrible, honest reality. Thanks for listening, guys. If you enjoyed, then please consider donating to my PayPal, which is linked in the description box. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Lots of love, especially to Sasha Dewan. Bye!